Hey everyone, it's Tom Abbott here. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on all things governance. So we're going to be talking about the three most common and well-known governance models in the NPO space, starting with the traditional model of board governance. We'll also talk about the policy governance model, also known as the Carver model. And last but certainly not least, we'll be going deep into the complementary model of board governance. This kind of puts it all together. This is the model that was developed by my late great father, Thomas Abbott Sr. As a quick intro, my name is Tom Abbott Jr. Some of you may know me as TJ, that's short for Tom Jr., because I used to work with my dad for a couple of decades, and it got very confusing in the office when people would call and say, "Is Tom there?" And both my dad and I would go, "Yep, right here." So you can call me TJ or you can call me Tom. Sadly, my dad passed away 4 years ago, March 22nd. He was a staple in the NPO community across Canada, and I'm just honored to be able to continue serving the NPO community and really keeping his legacy alive. So my wife and I took over AMC NPO Solutions about 6 years ago, and in that time we've been delivering governance webinars and governance live in person, not so much these days, of course, with lockdowns, but we've been delivering live in person and webinars for strategic planning and for governance. So happy to have you guys here today. So let's keep going. So it all starts when we're looking at governance, whatever model your association adopts, there are certain responsibilities of board members which are consistent. So number one, there are certain legislated responsibilities, and these of course are explicit in law. And then you have traditional responsibilities. So what do those look like? Well, we'll start with the legislative responsibilities. So the ones that are explicit in law. And this is where it all starts, right at the top. Directors must act honestly, in good faith, and in the best interest of the organization. This is key. And I love the in best interest of the organization part, because that starts getting into potential conflict of interests, which we have seen in some not-for-profit organizations and also in certain levels of government, right? Where you see conflicts of interest, either real or perceived. What would a normal person think could be a potential conflict of interest? So that's the very first legislative responsibility, is as directors we must act honestly, in good faith, and in the best interest of the organization. That's number one. Directors must exercise care, diligence, and skill of a reasonably prudent person. So that is the standard, the minimum basic standard to which you, as a board member, are held. To exercise care, diligence, and the skill of a reasonably prudent person. That's your number one responsibility. Nothing in any contract, the constitution or bylaws of the organization, or the circumstances of your appointment relieves directors of these responsibilities. So it's sort of like that old expression where you say there are two rules of customer service. Number one, the customer's always right. Number two, see rule number one. So really here, nothing in any contract, your constitution or bylaws, any circumstances of your appointment, why you're there, none of that relieves you of your responsibilities mentioned above. So please keep that in mind. Well, then there are some traditional responsibilities. So once we've gotten through the ones that are explicit in law, well, then we look at traditionally, what are you responsible as a board member? And this is so great because half of you are board members. And for those of you who are staff, it's important for you to be able to hold them to account and remind them of their responsibilities. So really, what is a director responsible for? Well, planning, hence strategic planning. Goal setting. Where do we need to go as an organization? So planning, policy setting, governance policies. That's your role. That's your responsibility. Hiring and evaluating the chief executive officer, otherwise known as your chief staff officer or your chief staff person. So hiring that person, monitoring organizational effectiveness. That's a huge responsibility for the board. And then, of course, complying with legal requirements. So these are the traditional responsibilities. We are in crazy times, now more than ever, right? And the world has changed, So one thing that we notice as a big change is this sense that we're just always running and we just can't keep up. And I'm reminded of this great quote from the famous book Through the Looking Glass, written in 1871, mind you. Here we are, it's 2020. In 1871, the Red Queen says, "It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." How many of you feel that way sometimes? Just type yes in the chat. I know that I do. It's crazy. Even now, under these strange conditions under lockdown, I don't know about you, but I'm busier than ever. So it's just crazy. So we just have to keep running just to stay in the same place. It's very frustrating. So why is that? What's going on? Well, look, longer work weeks, right? We were always hoping that technology would make it so that we would work less and it would be easier. No, for some reason technology has made us, connected 24/7. Our devices are always going off and we've got desktops, laptops, tablets, phones. It doesn't end. We're getting notified left, right, and center. So longer work weeks and increasing demand. What we've also noticed over the course of the last 50 years, of course, is dual career families. So now we've got both partners in the household who are working full-time, sometimes multiple jobs just to get by, just to make a living. So why is this important? When you've got longer work weeks and you've got both people in the household who are working, now more than ever, people are stressed out. They have very little time. In fact, their time is precious. So many of you have probably found it increasingly challenging to recruit volunteer directors and to recruit volunteers, period, in any capacity in your NPO. So we have to make sure that we're delivering tremendous value to them when they're volunteering their precious time. So we've noticed a changing role of volunteers. And the objective is to design a governance and management structure that will increase the effectiveness of the volunteers by focusing their time on the key areas of governance. This is what we're trying to move directors to. Rather than being, roll up your sleeves, super hands-on, getting into the meat and potatoes, the nuts and bolts of the organization. Sometimes that's fine for smaller organizations, especially when you're just starting out and you don't have budget to recruit or to hire paid staff. And as an association evolves and grows, it's time for the volunteer directors to also evolve and grow. And they need to shift their role, change their role to one where they're focusing on key areas of governance. So let's talk about the governance and management functions. Planning and policy setting, implementing. So these are all the things that need to get done in a not-for-profit organization, right? Planning and policy setting, the actual, okay, let's get it done, the implementing. There's also the monitoring. So how are we doing? Okay, and let's kind of break down what this looks like in terms of time demands. So you've got the planning and policy setting always starts at the beginning, and it takes quite a bit of time, right? You've got to get it right. But then the implementation, the execution, the actual doing it, that takes up most of the time. And that's why most organizations, as they get to a certain size of members or budget, for example, bring on paid staff so that they can execute, they can implement. And that's going to take most of the time in the organization. And then, of course, there's monitoring. So we get to the age-old question of who does what? Who does what? Right? So let's take a look at the breakdown. Who does what? And this is very common. There's often confusion. So the board is responsible for the planning and the policy setting. The implementation is the staff. And by staff, it would be the chief staff officer who's responsible for that. And then, of course, they can delegate that to their paid staff, of course, right? And then the monitoring. The monitoring is the joint responsibility of both the board and the staff. Here's where they work together. The monitoring. How are we doing? how effective are we in the implementation of our planning and policy setting, all right? So let's dive right into the three models. So we've got the traditional model, the policy governance model, otherwise known as the Carver model, and the complementary model of board governance. So when we look at planning and policy setting, we start looking at certain things that need to get done, and then we look at, is this a function of the board or a function of staff? So when it comes to gathering information, now this is with the traditional model. When it comes to gathering information, it's the function of staff. Preparing the options, staff. Developing the recommendations, staff. Discussing options, that's a joint role, a joint function between board and staff. So think about it. You're at a board meeting, right? There's something that needs to get done. Well, the staff would be tasked with gathering the information, preparing the options, making a recommendation based on their research. Then it would be discussed at the board level, and this function would be shared by the board and the staff. The discussion. But now the decision on the policy, the decision on the plans is solely that of the board. The board makes the decision. So this is how it would look in that scenario. Now the implementation, you can see a whole bunch of tick marks there. Yup, the staff, of course, is responsible for developing the implementation plan. So think about it. At a board meeting, or a strategic planning session, there's all this discussion, the preparation has been done, discussion by board and staff, but then of course the board will make the final decision. Now they will send the staff off, the executive director or the chief staff officer, to then formulate and develop that implementation plan. Now part of implementing any plan could include hiring staff, staff assignments, staff evaluations and appraisals, setting staff salaries, right? So they would control the staff salaries, any staff terminations or staff grievances, and handling the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day administration of the association office is all under implementation, all by the staff. And then monitoring, as I said, that's a shared function between board and staff. So this is how it would typically look in most organizations, but particularly the traditional model. So how does monitoring look like? Well, there are reports to the board from committees, right? So how do we monitor? How do we monitor organizational effectiveness in an association? Well, there are reports to the board that come from various committees. There's also reports to the board from the executive committee. You'll also have reports going to the executive committee from other committees, right? There would also be reports from the executive director to the executive committee, and some reports from the executive director themselves to the board. And finally, a review of financial statements. So looking at the balance sheet, income and expense statement, cash flow statement, etc. So all of that is how we monitor. So now let's shift gears to the policy governance model. A very popular model, also known as the Carver model. So this is adopted by about 75% of you on this webinar. So you're going to find this particularly relevant, whether you're board or staff. So what does the policy governance model look like? Well, there are a number of principles. The first principle is that the board owns the organization as trustees. So the board owns the organization as trustees. And the board prescribes what are known as ends, not the means, except to say what is unacceptable. So those would be executive limitations. So the board prescribes what they call ends. Here are the ends, the goals, the objectives, what we want to have happen in this organization. And they direct the executive director to achieve the ends. The means are not within their concern. So they prescribe the what, but not the how. The how is left to the chief staff officer Now, of course, there have to be some measures of control or monitoring to make sure that the executive director doesn't just go off without any direction whatsoever or without any controls. So that's where the limitations come in. Executive limitations, where they talk about what is not acceptable in terms of behavior or performance. So the board develops policies to an acceptable satisfaction level. And the executive director does not report directly to the chair, but to the entire board. So the chair is not the boss of the executive director. The chair is not the employer. It's the board as a whole. The board hires, evaluates, terminates the executive director. So the ED does not report to the chair, but reports to the entire board. And in a relationship, in their working relationship, the executive director and the chair are peers. They work together. There's no hierarchy. There's no fighting over who's superior and who's subordinate. The ED and the chair are seen as peers in this model. The board speaks with one voice or not at all. So there has to be unity as far as the board is concerned. There's nothing worse than having rogue directors going off and saying, I don't agree with this, or here's my position on that, and really undermining decisions of the board. So the board speaks with one voice or not at all. That's one of my favorite principles of any governance model. I love that. Board committees exist to help the board do its work, not to help or advise the staff to do its work. So board committees exist to help the board do its work around policy setting, planning, not execution. So board committees are not designed to help or advise the staff, executive director, etc., to do its work. Those are very distinct things. In the policy governance model, there's no executive committee. So we've been conducting a survey for the last 25 years, maybe more. I think about 25 or 28 years, a salary and operations survey, where we ask executive directors in the not-for-profit space how many of them still have executive committees. And year after year, as time goes by, fewer and fewer associations have an executive committee because they find that these days perhaps they're not needed. There was a time when it might have been difficult to get everybody together, might have been difficult to communicate and have the whole board make quick decisions. And that was kind of the purpose of the executive committee, right, in some sense. But the reality is now with technology, with webinars, with WhatsApp messages, SMSs, phone calls, it's never been easier to actually get people together virtually to make a quick decision. So a lot of NPOs find that there's really no need for executive committees. If they do have an executive committee, their focus or scope is very narrow and very specific. Other than that, no need. So with the policy governance model, no executive committee. The board monitors, this is what I touched on earlier, the board monitors only against approved ends and executive limitations. That's their purpose. So one of the biggest criticisms of the policy governance model, one of the reasons why a lot of boards find and directors find it a bit frustrating and not a great use of their time to sit on boards that are policy-only boards, is they feel like their talents and skills are underutilized and they're basically there just reading reports. That's what we hear from a lot of volunteer directors. And that's why more and more organizations are shifting away from the traditional model. So you had the traditional model, which had some limitations, and then the policy governance model filled some of those gaps. But a lot of people feel like the pendulum swung too far to the other side in terms of board involvement. And then it went from very hands-on working boards to extremely hands-off monitoring boards, and that's all they do. So is there a comfortable space in between where boards can really feel like they're making a contribution and making a difference? Well, yes, there is. And we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, okay? But with the Carver model, the board monitors only against approved ends and executive limitations. And the executive director's performance equals the association's performance. So there's a lot of responsibility put on the shoulders of the executive director. When they succeed, the organization succeeds, and vice versa. So this is a really important thing here. So here are some operating features. So the board works exclusively on policies, exclusively, all right, to the frustration of a lot of volunteers. The board defines ends policies. The strategic plan, long-term goals, and annual budget are developed by and belong to the executive director. Woof! What does that mean? As I said, tremendous amount of power and responsibility in the hands of the executive director. They develop the budget. They control the budget. They don't need approval from anybody. It belongs to the ED. So again, boards often feel like they have no say in what happens in the organization as far as, allocation of funds, budgeting, expenditures, all of that stuff. It's hands off. The strategic plan, the goals, and the budget developed and belong to by the ED. All the board does on a policy governance board is set ends and monitors executive limitations. That's it. So very narrow focus. And a lot of volunteers feel like, I wanted to make a bigger difference than this. Okay. The chair defines the agenda. It's standard as well with the complementary model. We'll get to that. Executive limitations are defined. There are 3 monitoring options. We'll dive deeper into that in a few minutes. Few, if any, committees, because again, the committees are there to serve the work of the board. And what the board is doing is they're working on policies. So they might need a policy task force or something like that, but there are relatively few, if any, committees for the board. Short policy manual, shorter board meetings. So that's good news. I mean, say yes if you want less board meetings or shorter board meetings. I sure do. I've been to a lot of board meetings where I was extremely bored, right? So this is the great thing. I mean, if a board does focus exclusively on policies, well, there may not be that much board work to do at board meetings, resulting in shorter meetings. So that's always good. And of course, greater accountability for the executive director, because so much belongs to them, right? They are basically owning the association belongs to them. So there's a lot of accountability for the executive director. All right. It also attracts a different type of volunteer, right? So depending on the structure of the governance model, that's going to attract a whole different kind of volunteer. So you've got to make sure that your model fits the type of person that you want serving on your board of directors. So let's look at board policy development work. What do they work on? Ends policies, executive limitation policies, board or executive director policies, board governance policies. Boy, could I say the word policy more times? This is what the Carver model is all about. Policies, policies, policies. So what we're finding is a lot of boards, while a lot of boards are saying that yes, we are on the Carver model or the policy governance model, they're not doing it purely or 100%. This has been the biggest challenge with a lot of boards in adopting the policy governance model, is they say, we love a lot of things about it. We love the structure and the division of roles and responsibilities, but it does move the pendulum too far to one side, and the board is not as involved as they would like to be. So what more and more boards are finding is even if they officially adopt the policy governance model, they're actually using more of a hybrid of that, right? The Carver boards leave the ED exposed and becoming the scapegoat, for sure, right? So there's a lot of flaws with a pure Carver model, which is why more and more organizations are shifting away to what's known as the complementary model of board governance that my father actually designed over 20 years ago. And a lot of boards, so it's neat when we did the poll to see who's doing what, and 24% are following the traditional model, and about 76% are following the policy governance model. And I think none entered the complementary model of board governance, but I would imagine, based on the comments here in the chat, that many of you, while officially adopting the policy governance model, are probably using more of a complementary model approach. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So thanks for these great comments. This is perfect. Okay, so let me get back to the deck here. So with the complementary model of board governance, one of my favorite books, and my dad was a huge fan of Peter Drucker, and in the book Managing for the Future, Drucker says, nonprofits waste uncounted hours debating who is superior and who is subordinate, the board or the executive director. The answer is they must be colleagues. Each has a different part, but together they share the play. Their tasks are complementary. The two have to work together as one team. So when my dad read that passage, it just dawned on him that the existing models of board governance were not working in their purest form. And he thought, no, we need to come up with a governance model that is complementary, that actually has the board and the staff working together as a team. So what does that look like? So here are the complementary model principles. This is what this model is all about. And in fact, it's adopted by about 1/3 of not-for-profit organizations in British Columbia. So 1/3 of NPOs in our survey that we do every single year, our most recent survey, we asked which governance model do you adopt? 1/3 of them said, they reported that they follow the complementary model of board governance. So that was pretty cool. The board is responsible for both the governance and management of the society. Wow. Okay, so right out of the gates, here's some distinctions. The board is responsible for both the governance and management of the society. So what do we mean by that, or why is that so important? Well, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act says, subject to this act, the directors shall manage or supervise the management of the activities and affairs of a corporation. All right? So what does that mean? The board is responsible. Now, they don't have to manage, but they are responsible for supervising the management. And of course, they can delegate that to paid staff, right? Which we'll get to. But the board ultimately has responsibility for both the governance and the management of the society. The executive director is designated the chief staff officer and is accountable to the board for the management of the society. This is huge. So why do we believe that the executive director should be designated the chief executive officer? Why is that? Well, the Dictionary of Business Terms reads, the chief executive officer is the officer who has ultimate management responsibility for an organization. The CEO reports directly to the board of directors and appoints other managers to assist in carrying out the responsibilities of the organization. If that doesn't define your role, and half of you on this webinar are the chief staff officer or paid staff, if this doesn't define your role as an executive director, then I don't know what does, right? This sums it up perfectly. Yeah, good point here from Kim. Kim says the organizational success under Carver is very dependent on the ED. EDs, like anyone, have strengths and weaknesses. The board cannot share their experience and skills. That's true. One of the shortcomings of the Carver model, for sure. Your ED is designated the chief executive officer and is accountable to the board for the management of the society. You are CEOs. Just because it's not for profit doesn't make it any different from a for-profit organization. Your role is the same. You have ultimate management responsibility for the organization. You report to the board and you appoint other managers to carry out the duties of the organization. Very clear. The senior elected volunteer position is the chair of the board of directors. The chair of the board. What we find in a lot of organizations is confusion when they're called president. Some organizations, it's president and CEO. and then some, the CEO or the ED is the chief staff officer, and you have a chair of the board of directors. So it can get a bit confusing. So with the complementary model of board governance, we try to go from confusion to clarity. So the chief staff officer is the chief executive officer, the CEO, and the senior elected position on the board is the chair of the board, just like that. Okay. The board is responsible, so here's where we start dividing the roles. The board is responsible for determining all governing policies of the society, while the CEO is responsible for determining all administrative policies of the society. So even for some of you who are, following the Carver model, but not, strictly, maybe you have this division of roles and responsibilities where the board determines governance policies of the society and the CEO is responsible for administrative policy. So what we find is that there's a hybrid that can be used that works really well. The board defines and approves a code of conduct for the directors and a separate code of conduct for the CEO. So this is where we get to, monitoring and accountability. That's so important. Just because they're volunteers doesn't mean there shouldn't be some accountability or evaluation to see how they're doing, or a code of conduct. Here's how we need you to behave to conduct yourself on this board of directors. Super important. Within that code of conduct could also include, of course, conflict of interest guidelines. And you get your directors to sign that code of conduct to make sure that they've read it and they will adhere to it. Super important. So that's for the board. So I have a question here. I say the CEO is accountable to the board. To whom is the board accountable? Well, the board is accountable to a number of people. Certainly the board's accountable to members. They're the ones who voted them in, and the association should serve the members. So the board is accountable to the members. The board is accountable to any other stakeholders in the community. The board is accountable to government as stakeholders, accountable to the Societies Act, the Corporations Act. So there's various entities to whom the board is accountable. It's important to have that code of conduct for the CEO. How will they, so what can and can they not do? In the same way that we want to make sure that everything is clear for the board, we want to make sure there's clarity as well for the executive director, for the CEO. Okay. In the complementary model of board governance, there are 3 types of committees or task forces. This is how work gets done. You have policy task forces, board statutory committees, and CEO working committees. What's that? Well, of course, the policy task forces are there to obviously look at the feasibility of doing something. Okay, maybe the feasibility of having taking on a new initiative or a new policy or a new program. Board statutory committees are there to help the board do their work. But then you have CEO working committees. Well, what's that? How many CEOs here, how many EDs on this webinar would love to have more hands on deck, would love to have more help and support in the office? And sometimes you just can't, my chat's lighting up, and sometimes you just don't have the financial resources to hire more staff. So you need volunteers. So you as the CEO can strike what's known as a CEO working committee, where you would recruit volunteers to your committee. Those members report directly to you. That's your committee, not a board committee. So you could, in essence, let's say you could have one of your volunteer board members might serve on your CEO working committee and report to you. Interesting, right? To help you get some of the day-to-day administrative work done. Then you as the CEO would provide a committee report to the board, right? As part of your ED CEO report. Anyway, so these are the 3 very distinct types of committees or task forces. And there are 4 monitoring options available to the board. There's the CEO report, which I just talked about. There are the committee reports. There's also any external reports. So maybe you've had a review or an audit done. In fact, we were just engaged a couple months ago by an organization in Ontario to perform a governance audit, where we reviewed all of their governance documents and prepared a report with our recommendations of best practices in terms of nomenclature, terms of office for the directors, are all the policies up to date, a bylaw review, all of that is part of a governance. We love doing that. A lot of people can't stand it, but I love governance, as you could probably tell. So external reports like that would be included as part of a monitoring option. And then, of course, financial reports. 8, the board does an annual written appraisal of the CEO. This is so important because as your employee, this is the only employee the board has, right? So the board has one staff member, and that's the CEO, your ED. So they need to know how they're doing on a regular basis. Okay. Next is the governance committee coordinates written appraisals of the directors. So the governance committee coordinates written appraisals of directors. Okay. And 10, board training is a priority budgeted item. All right. So those were the 10 principles of the complementary model. Well, then there's a number of features. So the board establishes governing policies and the CEO implements those policies. Both monitor organizational effectiveness. The board approves the strategic plan of the organization. The board approves the annual financial budget of the organization. So here this is very different from the policy governance model, very different from Carver in its purest form. The executive committee's mandate is explicit and limited, right? So whereas with Carver there's no executive committee, here if you have one, make sure that the mandate is explicit and it's very limited in scope. The number of board committees is reduced. Board meetings become shorter as a result of all of this. The CEO establishes administrative policies for the organization. And there are 2 society manuals, board governance and staff policy and procedures manual. The chair is responsible for the meeting agenda, similarly to the Carver model. The secretary is not responsible for drafting the minutes. The secretary is responsible for the safekeeping of them, responsible for the minutes being done, but can delegate that to a staff person, as most organizations do. And the same thing for the treasurer. The treasurer is not responsible for presenting the financial reports to the board, because quite often the treasurer isn't aware of the day-to-day expenditures. So they're responsible for the maintenance of that. I think that the treasurer should be as informed as possible, but the presenting of that report can be delegated to the CEO or a senior staff person in finance, for example, that is better equipped to answer some specific questions about the financial position of the organization. So let's just wrap this up right here. When it comes to planning and policy setting, gathering information, staff. Preparing the options, staff. Developing the recommendations, staff. Discussing options, shared function. And then the decision on policy and plans is that of the board. Implementation, again, it's all staff. That's why you're so busy. That's why, my friends, you need to strike CEO working committees to help offload a lot of this work. And of course, the monitoring is shared between the board and the staff. Yes, you do have a structured orientation program for your directors, right? So that's great. Perfect for onboarding. There's nothing worse than people volunteering their time and having a lack of clarity about what they should be doing. A lot of them feel like they're like a fish out of water, or they've just been dropped down. So it's really, really great to have some sort of orientation so they can get up to speed. That orientation could be done by the chair or the past chair. What a wonderful way for a past chair to pass on the mantle, or to make sure that the board is in a great position before they leave the board by doing this orientation. So it should either be done by the chair or the past chair, maybe jointly with the CEO as well, so that the ED or CEO can inform this new director of what's going on in the office. So I think kind of that shared orientation could be really, really useful. So that's really great. Oh, and I wanted to remind you, when we talked about minutes and whatnot, that the secretary is not responsible for taking the minutes, but for having them recorded. And some of you may engage, a minute taker to do it, or have some staff person do that for you. We've got a really great online course on how to run effective meetings. So I'm happy to send you guys some information about that, but that's a very popular webinar that we have on how to run effective meetings. It's all about the roles and responsibilities of the chair versus the participants, and how to handle conflict of interest at meetings, and a whole bunch of really great stuff that seems to come up all the time during board meetings. It's a great online course that we have, so I'll send you some details about that. So we've just gone through the 10 principles of the complementary model of board governance. We've gone through quickly the operating features of the complementary model. As I mentioned, I'm going to send you guys this deck. I've got some really great cheat sheets and little tip sheets that I want to share with you as well. Feel free to ask me any questions. And I just want to leave you with this. This is what Drucker says. What do these volunteers themselves demand? What makes them stay? And of course, they can leave at any time. The first and most important demand is that the nonprofit have a clear mission, one that drives the organization. The second thing that this new breed requires, indeed demands, is training, training, and more training. So what do you need to train volunteers on? So in this orientation, for example, well, they need to learn about the society, its mission, its governance style, about their place in the organization, about their committee, its mandate, timetable, etc., about how to get the most out of their committee, how to run effective meetings. How do you do that? Well, there's a few ways. Through the board governance manual that we talked about earlier, volunteer orientation, and that's great. 74% of you have a formal orientation for new directors. That's great. And also through training. So as I mentioned, we've got this great webinar coming up on how to run a great course, rather. I can send you details on that. It's an online course on how to run effective meetings. So I can send you guys details of that as well. So I just want to thank you all so much for spending your time today to kind of get an overview of the 3 alternative governance models. I hope you guys have found this useful. I'm going to stay on this call for a few minutes and answer any questions that you all have. For those of you that need to sign off, thank you for joining us, and we'll be in touch really soon. Stay safe, keep your loved ones happy and healthy. Take care, everyone. So I had a question. Someone asked, can you expand on what is under planning, to what extent? Without knowing all the context of the question, planning is strategic planning, policy setting. All right. So one thing that we do is we facilitate strategic planning sessions with boards, and now we're doing them all virtually. So just like this, and we actually set up breakout rooms, and it's very interactive, as you can see, with the chats and the polls and the video and everything. So strategic planning is such an important part of board work. So if you guys need any help at all with strategic planning, if you want to plan a virtual session, reach out to us, and we can. We only really need about a week's turnaround. And what's great is there's no travel arrangements and no travel costs. It's super easy. So if you're looking for a strategic planning session or governance session like this, but expanded, tailored to your association, feel free to reach out. Thanks for the question, Linda. Are we going to get the PowerPoint after the webinar? Yes, I'm going to send that to you. Absolutely. Linda says, one challenge I see with the Carver model is you can't always think of every single policy. And then when something comes up, the ED hides behind the model. How do you find the right balance? Whew. Yeah, it's tough, right? So, with the Carver model, and you've got the ends and then the limitations, it's sort of like there's always some gray area. It's very difficult. So that's why more and more boards are moving to the complementary model of board governance, where you look at the reporting. So there's the code of conduct. And I'll send you a sample code of conduct as well with the wording. I bet you guys would all love that. Let me type this in. I'll send you sample codes of conduct and conflict of interest guidelines. I spelled guidelines wrong, but you know what I mean. Okay, so I'm going to send that to you guys as well. Great question from Francis here. In the complementary model, are policies only developed by task forces as they arise, for example, ad hoc, or is this ever delegated to a standing committee like governance committee? Great question. The short answer is both. All right, so if it's a new policy, for example, yes, you would set up a policy task force specifically for that purpose, that policy. So if there's something that the board is considering, yes, strike a policy task force with a specific mandate and a clearly defined mandate and time horizon. What's the purpose and when will this task force be done? All right. But yes, you could also have a standing committee, a governance committee. So there might be certain things that might be handled by a governance committee on a regular basis that maybe doesn't need a new task force struck. So I would have to actually see what specific policy are you talking about to see if it falls within the terms of reference of the governance committee. So the short answer is it kind of depends. Kim, great question, asks, what are the main differences between traditional model and the complementary model? So I'm going to send you a really great graph, a visual graph that shows you all three governance models as well as certain things or certain functions and what the board and the staff do in each of those situations depending on what governance model it is. I think that'll make it super clear. But at the end of the day, just to kind of summarize it big picture, the traditional model is typically more working boards where the boards are responsible for doing everything. They do all of the work. Working board, typically smaller organizations, right, that maybe can't afford staff, so they can't delegate. With the comp model and the Carver model, but with the comp model in particular, it's for slightly larger organizations that can afford, 1, 2, 3 or more staff. They can hire a CEO who's responsible for the management of the society, and then there's able to have a more clear division of roles and responsibilities between the board and the staff. So not primarily a working board like the traditional model. Okay, I hope that helps. Right. So Francis asks a question about, what's the prevalence or appropriateness of the CEO ED being a voting director of the board? Yeah. As far as best practices, the executive director or CEO should not be a voting member of the board. They shouldn't be a member of the board. Talk about conflict of interest. The board of directors is their employer. So that doesn't make much sense. So really, from an organizational perspective, the board of directors is the employer of that CEO. That's what the relationship needs to look like. That's what the relationship needs to look like. Once you start, that gets murky waters. So, I wouldn't even go there, okay? Keep it. One thing that we love about the complementary model is clarity in terms of roles and responsibilities, who does what. So for me, that would be a no. The ED CEO is not a voting director of the board. Okay, when transitioning from policy model to comp model, can established policies be easily adaptable to the new model, or do a whole new manual needs to be developed? The short answer is easy to adapt. It's quite possible, Deanne, that you're already kind of in that midpoint anyway in terms of how your association actually governs itself. So it's a fairly easy transition, and this is something that we could help you with. I know, right? So this is something that we could help you with around how to make that transition. The policy manual probably just needs a minor update, but we're happy to look at that and help you with that, Deanne. Yeah, easy transition, and important to get that clarity right from the beginning. Yeah, it's so great. Wonderful question. Yeah, do I know how this is applied in the US? So I'm not sure what you mean by how this, because we've covered a lot of stuff. But as far as governance, so I would always defer, right? So just do a quick Google search. So in Canada, it would be like, Societies Act, for example, Registrar of Corporations, Registrar of Societies. So do a quick Google search in your city, your state in the US, right? Whoever oversees not-for-profit organizations, and just make sure that it's consistent with your specific society's act. That will always take priority over everything else. Number one is the Societies Act, and then it's your bylaws and constitution. Those are the two things that you always need to be looking at, okay? That's the challenge, okay? So Linda has a great question here. Linda asks, in the Carver model, how does the board balance its role as a policy in monitoring and the ability to ask for more information that they may want beyond what's stated? Management will push back that it's not in the policy or ends requirements. Well, that's the fundamental. Your question is actually the answer. Your question is the answer. So the answer is yes, management will always push back. And you find this conflict happening with the policy governance model. Because boards need more information. They need more information. But EDs can sit back and just say, hey, look, that's none of your concern. I handle all of this stuff. So that's a need to know basis, and you don't need to know that. And that's not a fault of the CEO. That's just how this model was set up. And I understand it was set up that way to have that super clear division as a response to some failings of the traditional model. But as I said, the pendulum has swung too far to the other side, and you find board members feeling as though they're in the dark and they're out of the loop. So the complementary model allows for more teamwork and collaboration and information sharing. So that's a great question. Great question. Wow, we've gone through all of them. Awesome. Well, look, I'm just amazed that we still have a number of you still on this webinar. I think I've gone through all of the questions. So with that, my friends, I'm going to officially sign off. I'm going to end the webinar. You're going to get all the great handouts and cheat sheets and whatnot that I promised to send you. So check your email shortly. As I mentioned, we've got a great meetings course as part of NPO Academy, our e-learning platform. I think you guys are going to love that. I'll send you some information about that. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all and need some help with governance or strategic planning. We're happy to help. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, everyone. Diane, au revoir. À la prochaine. Stay safe. Big hugs to your family. Bye, everyone.